Howdy, with this video, I want to go over the literary fiction terms list for essay number 1. Make sure you understand what the terms mean. Going to go through them very quickly. I assume you've had these before in other classes, but just want to review them. You're supposed to use at least 5 within your essay number 1. You don't have to define them, but you want to use them properly in the correct context to show that you know what they mean and that you're using them correctly. Going to go ahead and pop it up here. Like I said, I'm going to go very quickly. You can always slow me down on YouTube or speed me up by going to settings. It's kind of up to you. You can make me sound like Mickey Mouse if you want to. It's kind of up to you. Verbal irony. The words say one thing but mean another. At the end of the story of an hour, where she died of a love that kills. Boom, 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 boom. It's a good example of verbal irony. We know that she died because she's shocked at the idea that she has to go back into her cage after experiencing that little bit of freedom at the news of her husband's death. The whole thing just that dramatic and verbal irony taking place. You don't expect a woman to be happy that her husband died, but she kind of is. And it's a good example of dramatic irony where the opposite of what you think is going to happen actually happens. Dramatic irony, what are the odds of the family meeting the misfit within that short story? In the open boat, the strongest swimmer at the end is the one who dies. Good example of dramatic irony. So irony just kind of the opposite of what you think is going to happen actually happens, with the words say one thing but mean another. Ambivalence, it's when you kind of wavering between two possible meanings. Most religious works, kind of at least Western religious works, waver between two possible meanings. Either you're going to go up to heaven or you're going to burn in hell, right? And all the literature, all the discussions about that kind of resolves itself from one of those two outcomes. Same thing, just basic ambivalence. If I eat a candy bar now, it tastes good, but then you start putting on weight if you eat too much, right? You got to make that decision there. So sometimes you're wavering between two possible meanings. Ambiguity is when you have 3 or more possible meanings. Good example is when you get to when you start getting into A Rose for Emily. Faulkner develops that ambiguity. Is she a hero or is she a victim? Is she evil? By the time you're done with that short story, you know so much about her and all these different influences in her life that it's hard to come to one simple conclusion about who Emily is. It's a very good example of ambiguity. For mood and atmosphere, just kind of the feelings you get while reading the book. Sometimes you get that gothic mood. Somebody like Faulkner, where the men sit down in the chairs and the dust curls up around them, and they find the corpse in the room. Very gothic kind of mood going on with Faulkner. Same thing with Hawthorne. You go getting into a lab with Aminadab, stoking the furnace and all this stuff going on. A very ornate, very almost in a way supernatural kind of atmosphere going on in the birthmark. Symbolism we've talked about. Universal symbols tend to transcend cultures. Setting sun's an excellent example of somebody's writing your story and the sun's starting to set. You might have a little bit of a problem, right? On the other side, if somebody's writing about you and the sun's rising, maybe something good's about to happen in your life, right? The sun rising generally means rebirth, renewal, things like that. And it tends to cross cultures. Conventional cultural symbol, one that kind of means something to one particular culture. In other countries, the American flag may not mean much, but it means something to us. Locally, the Confederate flag creates problems, right? Is it a racist symbol? Is it a symbol of states' rights? And we start fighting about it. We don't always agree on these symbols and what they mean. Literary symbol, something that just happens within a work. A strand of iron gray hair is not something that means anything to our culture, or it's not a universal symbol, but it sure means a lot within A Rose for Emily. All of a sudden you realize, like, same thing, that little handprint on Georgiana's cheek and the birthmark, very much a literary symbol that Hawthorne develops only within that one particular work. An allegory, generally when the entire story is symbolic. Quite often Hawthorne's short stories are considered allegory. It's almost like you get to the end and you expect, like an Aesop fables, and the meaning of the story is, then you want Hawthorne to tell you what it means. But Hawthorne also creates a lot of ambiguity within his works, and makes it hard for the allegorical nature of it to have one simple explanation at the end. But Aesop fables are an excellent example of allegory, where you kind of get this, everything's symbolic, and at the end you kind of get a meaning out of it. Structure, how's the essay structured? Is it chronological? You can get something like A Rose for Emily that's very fragmented and you're jumping around in time. Uh, you know, who's telling the story, things like that. How's it just the basic story structured, and how do things happen within the story? When you get into something like Jesus Shaves, you're kind of inside and outside the person's head, and it kind of creates this postmodernist kind of fractured kind of structure a little bit, right? Foreshadowing, that sense of what's to come. If you really go back and reread A Good Man is Hard to Find, you're going to notice that the family passes a graveyard with 5 or 6 tombstones. The last town they go through is Tombsboro. The Misfits car is hearse-like. There's lots of foreshadowing about the demise of this family, the eventual demise of this family. Same thing with Rose for Emily. You got to put all the pieces together and you realize she bought the rat poison to kill Homer, and you get all these hints about what was actually going to happen. So by the end, you're not just totally shocked. It's like it didn't come out of this. Like you're not going to say it came out of nowhere, but you kind of go back and go like, oh, that's what that's doing there. That's what foreshadowing does for us. Plot. Uh, when I tell you don't do plot summary, that's just what happens in the story. Uh, this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens. I've read the story. I generally don't want you to give me plot summary. I want you to start talking about themes the author develops, right? So like in A Rose for Emily, you definitely see the Old South versus New South kind of theme, which ties into the theme of the modernists of the old world going away and this unknown new world developing, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that we're changing. Very dominating theme within a lot of Faulkner's works. Uh, but I'm not talking about what happens in the story. I'm talking about the meanings that Faulkner's trying to develop within them. The same thing, like with something like A Good Man's Hard to Find. O'Connor really discusses a lot of existentialist themes. And it's hard to tell sometimes if she's accepting those ideas or rejecting them. Um, Kind of depends which short story you're working with, but it's very fascinating, recurring theme within her works. Protagonist, this is the main character in the story. Uh, in A Good Man's Hard to Find, the grandmother is the protagonist. The antagonist is the second character that's kind of offset against the protagonist. So the antagonist in A Good Man is Hard to Find would be the misfit, right? You can't get more antagonistic than shooting someone, the protagonist, 3 times in the chest. Sometimes this can get a little more complicated. In A Rose for Emily, the protagonist is obviously Emily. We learn a lot about her. We change with her. Who's the antagonist there? Is it the town? Is it just everything in her life, including her father and all these other other things going on? A very interesting question there. Who's the antagonist in The Open Boat? Uh, who's the protagonist? We got 4 characters. They're not. They're kind of. We hear a little bit more from the correspondent, but they're not particularly well developed characters. In fact, at some points in the short story, you don't even know who's talking when they're talking, using dialogue there. Is the antagonist nature, or all these great forces in the lives that work against us sometimes? Uh, so sometimes that can be kind of a very interesting question to work with, particularly within your particular literary movement. Uh, Static or flat characters, characters that don't develop, they're kind of stereotypes. There's only a limit to how much Flannery O'Connor's going to develop the family, because she's got to kill them off at the end. And you don't want to be focused on that. You want to be focused on what's going on with the grandmother and the misfit and what's happening there. So fairly flat characters. They're quite often in realist fiction. They employ flat, stereotypical characters sometimes. You kind of see that in The Open Boat. Even Louise Mallory's not particularly developed in The Story of an Hour. She's kind of there, does this, and falls over dead, and you're like, well, okay, what do I do with this? Round characters, dynamic characters are generally characters who go through change. Uh, may not like the change, but we learn a lot about, say, Emily in A Rose for Emily. We learn quite a bit about the grandmother in The Misfit, because even after the family's killed, we're still with her, seeing what she's going to do. And eventually she kind of reaches out and makes that gesture towards the misfit, that makes kind of give him, what he's asking for. I want proof that God exists. So he's banging his hand on the ground and everything. And she kind of reaches out to somebody she knows is going to kill him, and just kind of sees his suffering and touches him for a second. And of course, he can't handle that. But kind of more round characters where you kind of get into the motivations and how they change throughout the short story. Um, Sympathetic characters are generally ones you tend to sympathize with. Kind of depends on you a bit. Some people identify with Emily and all these forces working against who you are. You know, right? She's a frustrated woman, a frustrated artist, just a frustrated human being with all these things happening to her. Sometimes you can feel for her, even though you probably don't condone murdering someone and sleeping next to their decaying corpse. A lot of these authors are going to play with some of these ideas, right? Point of view, who's telling the story? First person narrator, I. Uh, you get that with Jesus Shaves. Uh, the narrator's trying to tell a story about himself and what's going on in this classroom and things like that. Sometimes the first person narrator may not be reliable. If you've ever read a Poe short story like The Cask of Amontillado, the narrator is insane. He's literally telling you the story of how he lured a guy into the catacombs and walled him up there and buried him alive, basically. And you know, at the end, he kind of says, "And I never got caught." Ha ha ha! And you kind of like, okay, this person just told us the whole story. Can I rely on this person to be rational and reliable? Um, Also, sometimes, you know, how much is the narrator participating within the events can be a very, very interesting question. Third person narrator, uh, he did that, she did that, they did that, talking about other people. Again, same kind of thing. How much does the narrator know? Is the narrator omniscient and knows everything that's going on within each character's mind and in terms of history and everything that's going on in the story, or is it kind of limited where the narrator's just kind of going to kind of hang back and just tell you what's going on, and you got to kind of figure out what's going on. So the narration can be very interesting. Very interesting question about who's telling the story in A Rose for Emily. That's kind of this first person we, and there's parts in there where you kind of realize that we narrator is prone to gossip, may kind of hint at certain things. Can we rely on what the narrator's saying in A Rose for Emily? We're getting the whole story from this entity, whether it's one person or multiple people. But can we trust all these people, this narrator, all the time? Very interesting question there within A Rose for Emily. Setting, where does the story take place? Almost all of Faulkner's works take place in one county in Mississippi, where Jefferson's the county seat. So the southern setting is extremely important to people like Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner. You see settings very important for some of the romantics like Hawthorne. He wants to take you into some almost a fantasy land where he can explore these very symbolic ideas and develop this very fantastical kind of setting. Same thing with Poe, right? Sometimes you don't even know where the story's taking place, but it's just, you know, it's been a paragraph on the curtains in a room or something. It's very important about setting and what's going on in short stories. Other writers don't spend a lot of time with that. You kind of notice the setting's important with Stephen Crane. We're out in the middle of the ocean. There's no hope. We're all gonna die, and uses that setting to kind of develop things about survival and what it means to be a human being. Um, so it's kind of different for each author, what they're trying to do, what kind of mood or atmosphere they're trying to create. Style, the last one, just kind of what makes that author kind of unique. When you read Flannery O'Connor's short story, you're expecting dark humor, element of the grotesque, just these interesting things that happen to people, uh, particularly when things get kind of outside the norm of what we normally experience. But that sense of humor is classically O'Connor. Same thing with somebody like Stephen Crane, that irony. But with Crane, it's kind of this hopeful irony. It'd be interesting to see if he lived past the age of 29 to see what kind of literature he would have developed late in his later years. But kind of this very interesting. Crane likes to break some of the rules, and he develops his own kind of unique style. Same thing with Faulkner. But you kind of talk about humor or sentence structure or word choice, things like that, that kind of make an author unique. When you read that Hemingway short story for the first essay, if you only get through the first page and quit. That's it. You're going to notice that this is Hemingway. This you kind of feel like you're just starting in the middle of a movie. Lots of dialogue, not explained, not put into context, and you got to kind of keep going with the short story until you get to the end and kind of put it all together. Very interesting form of narration that's uniquely Hemingway's. People try to imitate it, but don't often succeed. But hopefully that helps a little bit. Tried to go as fast as I could. Like I said, hopefully you've had quite a few of these before. If you have questions about them, be sure to let me know. But again, we'll talk to you later. Bye bye.